All right. Welcome everyone to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. Thank you all for coming today. It's my great honor to introduce today Shadi Bartsch-Zimmer. Shadi Bartsch-Zimmer is the founding director of the Institute of Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago and the Helen A. Regenstein Distinguished Service Professor of Classics. She has authored and edited some 12 books on antiquity. Her book, Persius, A Study in Food Philosophy and the Figural, received the Charles J. Goodwin Award of Merit in 2016. And her translation of Vergil's Aeneid was published to acclaim in 2022. Her most recent book is a study of the reception of the classics in contemporary China, Plato Goes to China. Bartsch has been a Guggenheim Fellow, sits on the board of the AAR, edits the journal No, and has held visiting scholar positions in Europe and Taiwan.
Is that my cue to start?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here to listen to this book talk. And I feel I should say a few words by way of preface about why I chose this topic and why I thought it was meaningful. Because Plato Goes to China may seem like an odd topic for a mid-career academic to suddenly write. So I started thinking about looking at the Chinese reception of Western classical texts during a sort of midlife crisis I was having about my work some 15 or 20 years ago. And my crisis was that here I was spending decades writing books about texts and classics that maybe 87 people would read, and I was making about the same amount in royalty dollars. And this is before I translated the Aeneid, which sold better than that. So I was asking myself, was this meaningful enough to speak with and to so few people? And when I thought about this some more, I realized that my world was even more constrained than I had realized, because I had been educated in the European tradition with these very texts that I was working on, or at least with some of them. And now I was commenting on the works with which I myself had been educated and grew up. And so I was participating in a kind of closed hermeneutic circle where context and meaning were kind of all defined together, and I wasn't breaking out in any way. And there's actually a joke that to me really captures well the way I felt about how my intellectual life was. And it's not my joke. But the joke goes like this. There are two young fish swimming along in the sea, and an older, wiser fish comes along swimming in the other direction, and the older fish says, "How's the water, boys?" And the two young fish say, "Oh, it's fine, thanks." And then after he's gone by, they turn to each other, and one of them says, "What's water?" And I felt like because my context had been so, I had been so unaware of my own intellectual context and culture, I felt that doing something like this would really help me grow as well as learn things I didn't know. And I cast around in my mind for a culture that would be very different from the one I'd grown up in, a culture in which these texts that I'd grown up with were not necessarily foundational anyway. And I came up with mainland China as that area to fix on. And in retrospect, I think I should have just bought the convertible already in terms of midlife crisis. But I picked them because they represent such a great part of our population here on Earth. And B, there is a different intellectual, ethical culture, and I think that is still true today, even in a time of globalization. And C, because to the best of my knowledge, Western classics hadn't been a major object of study in China at that time. So as I started trying to read reactions to what I thought were the most influential classical texts, I ran into all sorts of problems right from the start. One of them was that 20 years ago, the Chinese still had not standardized the characters or Hanzi that they were using to represent classical names. So even if I knew that, for example, the way to say Socrates in Mandarin was Sugaladi, I didn't know which of those Su, Ge, Las, and Dis would be represented by which Hansa, so it made research difficult. Another thing that made research difficult is, of course, back then we didn't have the same internet resources that we have now, especially in terms of having access to publications online. And of course, the most difficult problem was that I didn't speak a word of Chinese, and none of what I was trying to read had been translated. So I had to learn Mandarin, and that was hard and took a long time. But eventually I started being able to read some material written over the past, say, 150 years by Chinese scholars. I made several unexpected discoveries right at the beginning that ended up shaping the whole arc of the book. So my first discovery was that there were ebbs and peaks in interest around these texts. And these ebbs and peaks centered around three big events of the 20th century in China. So first, in the intellectual ferment before the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, there had been an increasing volume of works engaging with Enlightenment and classical texts from the West, and finding in these works political values that were not yet well known to the Chinese, who, after all, had been in a dynastic system for millennia, right? So there was this intellectual ferment before the fall of the Qing that involved looking at a lot of texts from the West, and I'll go into that in more detail. The second period of growing ferment was in the 1980s, during the pro-democracy movement, when once again values like democracy or freedom of the press or freedom of speech started feeling more and more urgent, especially to college students. And as you know, this rise in interest in democracy in the 1980s did not end well. It ended with the events of June 1989, after which there was definitely a quiet period in terms of talking about Western values. And then the third period is pretty much right now. The past decade or two, amid the growth of Chinese nationalism, amid the new visions that Xi Jinping is expressing. What's interesting about the current state of affairs is that you will find two major ways of coming to classical texts. It tells me to sign on to avoid losing access to this whiteboard. Can I just ignore that? I'll just ignore it. Okay. Okay. I was talking about the present day. What has been the situation since the start of the century to the present day, I would say, is a general decline in the positive evaluation of these texts, although in a very complicated way. The Western classics themselves now are read in China in, I would argue, one of two major ways. One, they can be read and critiqued as offering values that are not good, not appropriate for human thriving, and definitely not aligned with the Chinese state itself. Or they are read in some cases as advancing wonderful values or speaking forms of truth that, however, the modern West itself no longer represents. So this would be a situation in which modern China, ancient China, and the ancient West all agree on values, but those values no longer represent the contemporary West, which is misguided, instrumentalist, soulless, what have you. And apart from those two ways of talking about the classics, one, they are good, but the West has fallen away, or two, they are not very good. There is one third way of talking about them, which is really an outlier represented only by one Chinese scholar, He Xin, and he basically argues that the Western classics don't exist. that during the Renaissance, a number of Western intellectuals looked to China's very serious philosophical tradition, felt bad that the West didn't have anything like that itself, and quickly wrote up all the works of Plato and everybody else and claimed that they were 1500 or 2000 years old. So that is a view that I don't really engage with seriously in the book. The points I'd like to engage with in the book today have to do, one, with the content of what was being read up to the fall of the Qing dynasty and shortly afterwards, when there was still hope that China might become a republic. As you know, China did not become a republic. Instead, it endured several decades of civil war, after which the CCP and Mao Zedong emerged triumphant in 1949. So I'd like to focus on what those readers, thinkers, and reformers hoped for from Western texts in that period, which actually they did not get, historically speaking. Then I'd like to focus on some of the negative views of classical texts that have been advanced in recent years, especially around the figure of Aristotle. And I'd also like to focus in this talk, if there is time, on the reception of Plato's Republic, and in particular, the reception of the story in the Republic of the ideal city, or Kallipolis, right, the beautiful state that Socrates voices halfway through the text. And even in the West, of course, there are many different ways of talking about that particular section of the text. And we don't have a consensus, but China's view on it, I think, is also very interesting and worth talking about. So let's start with the pre-fall of the Qing and the years immediately after the fall of the Qing. This was a period where China's reformers and intellectuals were clamoring for a new republic, and they felt themselves no longer in alignment with the Confucian values that had shaped the dynastic system. They weren't all the same, these reformers. There were traditionalists and radicals and anarchists and socialists, but they all felt that something had to change. And during their decades of research, these reformers and radicals had encountered political concepts that were fundamental to the West, but alien to China, through their increasing exposure to Western texts. So they were now looking to figures like Montesquieu or Rousseau or Dewey for their ideas. And they were also looking to the West's classical texts, in particular at this time to Aristotle's Politics and other Greek philosophical and political writings. Not all of these texts existed yet in Mandarin, and so some of them were only accessible through Japanese translations, but they compel the interests of many who wanted to think about a new political system for China. So many of the new ideas of this period were introduced through the writings of one hugely influential essayist and intellectual whose name was Liang Qichao, who lived from 1873 to 1929, who had fled China for Japan before the fall of the Qing dynasty after his role in some failed revolutionary activity. And from his point in Japan, he was writing a series of essays on Greco-Roman antiquity at an astonishing pace. From December 1898 to 1903, he published some 30 monographs on Greek and Roman history and politics. And his reach in terms of audience was magnified by his use of print media, and his ideas reached many on the mainland. He also had a journal entitled Journal of the New Citizen that had a very wide circulation. And he started introducing Aristotle's ideas, starting with an essay called The Political Theory of Aristotle. And he uses this essay to introduce new concepts to his audience. Remember, this is an audience that has largely grown up in a dynastic culture with Confucian teaching, right? So Liang writes quite boldly, Greek thought, I'm quoting him now, Greek thought is best represented by Athens, and Athenian knowledge is concentrated in the writings of Aristotle. Therefore, Master Aristotle is truly the singular representative of ancient civilization. The fact that politics could become its own discipline and develop as such to attain its soaring heights today must be credited to Aristotle as well. Now, I'm not vouching for the truth value of this statement. I'm simply saying that Liang Qichao, a very prominent intellectual, deeply felt that Aristotle was fundamentally at the beginning of the Western political tradition, and that Aristotle had things to say to the Chinese that they hadn't heard yet. Liang was particularly struck by the terminology with which Aristotle in the Politics described the nature of the citizen and his relationship to the city-state. As I'm sure many of you know, Aristotle felt that citizenship and participation in the city-state, the polis, was what made us fully human, that a human who wasn't engaged in politics or leadership or the life of the city hadn't realized his full potential. And of course, I'm using his deliberately, since women were not considered politics, nor were minors, nor foreigners, nor of course the slaves. Aristotle claimed that man was by nature a creature of the polis, a politikon zoon, a political animal, which sounds different in English from how he meant it in Greek, right? And only by fulfilling his nature could he reach his potential by understanding and applying such moral concepts such as justice, by serving in the law courts, by serving in the councils, by offering guidance, by being eloquent in the support of Athenian foreign policy with his fellow debaters and so forth. The state, in a way, was prior to the human because it was necessary for the human to come into his proper nature. And of course, these ideas that namely a human being or a man wasn't fully a man unless he participated in the state were completely alien to the Chinese dynastic system, in which advancement was largely regulated by the Confucian exam system that survived until 1906, and in which you had to succeed if you wanted to get out of your village. The citizen, a new idea, and Liang wants to write about this new idea to introduce it to the Chinese. So in this essay and in his another famous essay called On the Meaning of the New People, Liang adapted the extant Chinese word guomin, which just kind of meant resident, or subject of a country. He transformed it by saying it was now going to mean citizens of a nation in the Aristotelian sense, and thereby creating a language that could be used to parallel the language in Aristotle's Politics. And Liang was concerned with, how am I going to transform my fellow Chinese subjects into citizens? What is the vocabulary they need? What are the concepts they need? How can I introduce citizenship to them? And again, the answer is preponderantly through Aristotle, though also through a number of other Western Enlightenment thinkers. So Liang's usage of guomin made it a phrase that completely escaped its original Chinese linguistic situation and became deeply influenced by Western political theories. And Liang turned the dynastic system inside out. Instead of saying the emperor owned the people, he could say that the people, the citizens, the guomin, were the actual owners of the state. It was not the emperor who owned everything under heaven. Tianxia is the expression. So he writes, guomin is the ideal which sees the state as the common property of her citizens. The state is a collective accumulation of citizens without whom there is no state. No longer would the people of China be traditional imperial subjects. They would be modern Aristotelian citizens engaged in the political activity of a nation state. And ironically enough, the only place where Liang Qichao felt that Aristotle had made an error in his theories of politics was in the fact that Aristotle had included a critique of democracy in the politics and had pointed out that democracy could not actually be the best of the 6 possible political systems because the people had too much power and a republic would be better. But Liang says, oh, Aristotle made a mistake here. He says, I consider Aristotle's classification of 6 types of polities to be inapplicable. I believe that the matter of justice and injustice should be raised before this discussion can be complete. Only a democracy can be truly just. No other type of polity deserves the name. Why? Because a nation is a body formed by the people, etc. And then he ends the paragraph, this matter is obvious and I do not need to say more about it. Namely, that democracy is way better than having a republic, and Aristotle was just influenced by his Greek context. In China, it was clear to Liang that democracy would be best, right? He doesn't talk a lot about ideas of scaling or scope or anything like that. He's staying very ideological. So here we have a clear use of Western texts to transform, hopefully, the Chinese people into a people ready to take on the burden of republicanship should the Qing dynasty go away and never come back, right? And there was not just the invention of the word warming, of course, to aid in this transition. They were other new words like republic, democracy, society, science, rights, economy, right? All of these words mostly borrowed from Japanese and made to take on new meanings in Chinese. Well, you guys know how this all ended. There was no republic in the end. There was a series of warring Chinese warlords. There was civil war. And eventually the Chinese Communist Party won, and the Kuomintang were exiled to Taiwan. Okay, so for a while, this whole conversation goes underground. And of course, under Mao, even though there is still there is continuity in the publication of translations of ancient texts, nobody is really talking about democracy or Aristotle or anything like that. And Mao, as you might expect, was what's the word I'm looking for? Pretty skeptical about the values embedded in these texts. And already in Yan'an during the Long March in 1941, he explicitly criticized the intellectuals who cited Greek whenever they spoke. So there must have been a few of them still hanging around. And in his 1941 essay, Reform Our Studies, he wrote, many party members are still in a fog about Chinese history. There are many Marxist-Leninist scholars who cannot open their mouths without citing ancient Greece. But as for their own ancestors, they have been forgotten. Okay? And Mao himself commented on ancient philosophy in his work on dialectical materialism, where perhaps not surprisingly, he condemned Plato as an idealist and a reactionary for his argument that only the forms had any real existence. There weren't going to be any dialectical materialists who liked that point of view. All right, so then a lull. And then a few things start happening in the decades leading up to the 1980s. And I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but I do want to talk about a few things that were crucial. One of them was that a well-known economist, Goodwin, who in the 40s had helped to advise the Communist Party, went off and wrote a treatise about the ancient polis, and Athens in particular, in which he argued that the Athenians were successful because of the happy coincidence of their maritime trade and their democracy, both of which helped to inform each other. So in terms of their economy, they had benefited from their position as a maritime power. And in terms of the intellectual fervor and exchange of ideas, they had benefited from the fact that all citizens could speak, right? And so he suggested some reforms to the Communist Party. And long story short, he ended up in a jail cell with a hunk of bread. And he eventually died in jail. They tried to re-educate him a few times, but he was unre-educatable. But some of his ideas in his work about Western success and Chinese closedness or inward lookingness ended up being pretty powerful and influencing a 6-part Chinese TV show in 1988, where the producers of the show picked up on Gujun's ideas and metaphors and reproduced them in the show. The show was called River Elegy, and it was in some parts a comparison of the West and the East. And they used the language of the West. They used language about the West that was couched in images of travel, openness, blue skies, blue seas, trade, expansion. And then when they were talking about ancient China, they used the imagery of the Yellow River, the silt, the mud, the Great Wall as something to protect China, China as enclosed, as relying on rivers and not oceans, right? To make a very broad critique that that was taken to be of great interest by their audience members. And there are several students who responded with great excitement to this TV series and said, at last, somebody is speaking the truth. And this TV series, in turn, helped to feed the impetus that led to the student uprising, the demand for freedom of the press, of speech, civic rights, participation, representation, which, as you know, was shut down on June 4th, 1989 by Deng Xiaoping in a horrible and tragic event. Okay, then again, silence for a while. And then a re-interest in classics over the past 20 years, but an interest that, as I said at the beginning, has us reading the classics very differently, reading the classics against the West in many ways. So we could talk about many examples of reading the classics against the West. As I've said, they tend to be read either as a critique of their own values in antiquity or as representing better values in antiquity, which the West has fallen away from now. So one example is a well-known op-ed piece in the New York Times that came out, I think, in 1911 or so. And this op-ed piece was completely influenced by Thucydides and Thucydides' view of the Athenian democracy, right? So the op-ed author started by saying, in the history of human governance spanning thousands of years, there have been two major experiments in democracy. The first was Athens, which lasted a year and a half. The second is the modern West. If one defines democracy as one citizen, one vote, American democracy is only 92 years old. And in practice, it is only 47 years old if one begins counting after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Far more ephemeral than all but a handful of China's dynasties. Why then, he asks, do so many boldly claim they have discovered the ideal political system for all mankind and that its success is forever assured? That is his question, his very cynical question, right? Of course, the comparison between ancient Athens and modern American democracy is a very problematic one that he doesn't investigate in any ways. There are many, many differences, but making this analogy allows him to go back to Thucydides and Thucydides' statements about Athens and to claim that they are just as pertinent to the modern US. And this is an example of reading an ancient text and saying, this is a good text, and it shows that the West is bad, okay? So Lee looks to Thucydides and all but quotes him when he says that modern America is plagued by exactly the same problems. One, elected representatives have no minds of their own and respond only to the whims of public opinion as they seek re-election. This is from Thucydides, who also held that one factor contributing to the deterioration of the American Athenian democracy was the fatal inability of its citizens to make wise choices in leadership because of their need to flatter the masses. Thucydides believes that only Pericles could keep those rebellious Athenians under hand, but after he died, they just blindly followed anybody who seemed to be serving their best interest. Okay. Then Lee says that Thucydides says that the demagogues that succeeded Pericles were more on an equality with one another, and each struggling to be first himself, they were ready to sacrifice the whole conduct of affairs to the whims of the people. And Cleon in particular is this horrible demagogue in Thucydides. He's the first representative of the commercial class in Athenian politics. He is noted for his personal dishonesty in financial matters, his shouting in the assembly, his warmongering, his insults, his bullying speeches, right? His anti-elitist rhetoric, and the people love him. I am not drawing any analogies here of any kind whatsoever to the current state of politics, mind you. So once a country or a city-state has fallen into this mistake, democracy without a strong leader, it's doomed, right? And Lee's comparison of the lifespan of Athenian and American democracy leads him to end the op-ed piece by writing, "History does not bode well for the American way. Faith-based ideological hubris," that's what he calls American belief in democracy, "faith-based ideological hubris may soon drive democracy over the cliff." Okay. Why does he say faith-based? He says, there's no help for it. Americans have elevated democracy to the status of an absolute good, and even, he says, a form of religion. And in fact, a lot of Chinese do believe that Americans kind of have an abstract worship of democracy that isn't always soundly based on history and politics. So for Lee, this renders the Americans incapable of making choices that are not preconditioned by their religious beliefs, right? And he thinks that this is a very bad thing. He's using Thucydides to argue against the contemporary political and economic values of the West. And there are other ancient texts that lend themselves to this kind of use, because we have surprisingly few, indeed perhaps no, pro-democracy texts from classical Greece. Most of our texts are critiques of the democratic system, such as Thucydides' critiques. So they certainly lend themselves to critiques of contemporary democracy as well. Okay. The other approach is to say that the ancient texts are mistaken. And here Aristotle definitely suffers a dive, because where he was held up as so foresightful in the period around the turn of the century, now he is open to criticism in all sorts of ways, including his very idea that man is a political animal. So a lot of scholars who represent the party school of different universities and provinces have written essays criticizing Aristotle as enforcing slavery. And they don't mean the slavery of the people who are captured in war by the Athenians. They mean the slavery of the Athenian citizen. Why? Because it has been said by Aristotle that you are not fully a male human being unless you participate in the polis. But what, ask these scholars, what if you don't want to participate in the polis, right? What if you have a different job, right? You're not free all day to debate in the polis because you need to feed your family, and that happens to be, that demands that you work at the cardboard factory, right? Instead of going and talking downtown. Or what if you are an artist, And you think that fulfilling your artistic bent is the best use of your time on this earth. Well, Aristotle says no. Aristotle says you're only half a human being because you're not participating in the city. So here is one example of a criticism thrown at Aristotle. You think he's talking about freedom and citizenship? Nuh-uh. He's trying to enslave people with a mind frame that says that democracy is the only path to true humanity, right? Another criticism of Aristotle, he thinks his work is for everybody. He writes about the 6 kinds of government, but he doesn't know anything about parts of the world that aren't within his purview. Maybe the 6 forms of government are not the 6 forms of government. Maybe there's 27, maybe there's 100. How dare he recommend his to us? Or another critique, what does Aristotle call people who aren't Greek? Well, he calls them barbarians, right? What do the Chinese call people who aren't Chinese in those days? Barbarians, right? So they're like, how can Aristotle insist that non-Greeks are barbarians? He's the barbarian, not us, okay? So that's kind of a sillier example, but it's just a way of showing how the very frameworks that led to praising his politics in the old days now lead to thinking of his politics as a piece of Western ideology. Okay. There's also the argument, which I guess is anti-Aristotelian, that China's a democracy, right? They say, why should the Americans, and when I say they say, I'm largely talking about public intellectuals in China who currently are pro-nationalistic, right? There are other people who are not like that. There are people who focus on these works without thinking about politics so much. I'm really talking about a vocal group of politically involved readers. So another way of, as I said, criticizing the West and Aristotle is to claim that China itself is democratic and that the West is hogging the word democracy for just one particular kind of democracy. And this is just, this is unjust. Western democracy, quote, is only a temporary historical form of democracy and has largely been alienated as money politics and populist politics have come into play, and it's not suitable for other cultural backgrounds and historical development conditions in non-Western countries, taken from an article in a newspaper. Okay, and what else can we do? We can bash not only Aristotle, but the Athenian democracy itself, and there is a lot that is bashable, right? Here's from the same article. The connection of the West to classical Athens is not a commendable fact, but part of a shameful legacy. The American democracy relied on slave labor, denied women the vote, and dehumanized non-citizens. And the apple has not fallen far from the tree. And then it goes into a rant against the US. Okay, I've got, I think, about 5 to 10 minutes left. And what I'd like to do with those 5 to 10 minutes is talk a little bit about Plato's noble lie, I think. I'm not going to be able to get through all the material in the book, but the noble lie is very interesting. So Plato's noble lie, in a nutshell, in the Republic, when Socrates is talking about the ideal city, he says that in an ideal city, we'd have to inculcate all the citizens in a noble lie to assure the safety, security, and longevity of the state. And the noble lie, which they are told is true and are indoctrinated in, is that none of them had parents. They were all produced from the soil of Athens. And anything they remember before the age of 18 is just a dream that they had while they were in the soil. Okay, obviously this is an allegory. These new Athenians, who are told that they are growing out of the soil at age 18, these guys are actually divided into 3 classes by the philosopher kings, the iron class, the silver class, the gold class, right? And each person is told what class they belong to, right? And they're given jobs in the city that match their level. So if you're gold, you get to be a philosopher king. If you're silver, you're probably going to be a guardian and warrior. If you are iron or brass, you will be probably a worker or a merchant, right? How do you keep everybody in their place? You tell them that when they came out of the earth, They were already branded as gold and silver or bronze or iron, right? And so everybody believes that it's their own nature to be one of those three castes, and the work they're given matches their nature, and as such, they should be content with their lot, right? It's not unlike the old caste system. So Western philosophers reading this have always had a difficulty with it. What do you do with the noble lie? I mean, it sounds, it's bad. And it's also, close to eugenics and the whole thing because of the way that Plato has people breed. And the whole thing is very unsavory, right? Forget the security of the state. You don't want to have a caste system. Westerners have dealt with it three ways. One way has been to try to soften it. So to say, oh, the noble lie isn't really a lie. It's like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. It's a national myth. Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. Another way is to denounce it, as Karl Popper did in The Open Society, where he rants furiously about the noble lie and compares it to the horrors of World War II. And another third way is to set it on its head and say the ideal city is a warning, not a model, right? And in fact, even as Athens is cracking down on who can be a citizen and saying both your parents have to be citizens, thus creating a democracy of blood, right? So too, the noble lie is showing up ideologies that are unfair and nonsensical and yet adopted by the state. So in the case of Athens, the idea that both your parents have to be Athenian before you can be Athenian, so how is it really a democracy? And in the case of whoops, lost my train of thought there, sorry. So then on this reading, the Callipolis, the beautiful city, would serve as a mechanism for exposing the ideologies of the Athenian state that now seems to be investing in the idea of blood worth, right? Very aristocratic, not democratic idea. And the critiques of Plato I read that came out before 1989 were also critical in this way. They said this is not a good society, right? There's lying, there's a caste system, there's eugenics, there's very little, there's some potential for mobility, but it's really, really limited, right? You read articles written after Tiananmen Square of the past 20 years, and what's fascinating is that the authors shrug. Like, what's the big deal, right? Of course, governments lie to their people, they say. Anybody who thinks that governments don't lie to their people is naive. So, yeah, Plato is saying something here that we all already know, that there is hierarchy, that the government does misrepresent things for the good of the people, that people do have different skill levels and different abilities, that people are not equal, which is pretty much what Confucius would agree with. And in fact, there's been a book published recently by the Chinese philosopher Tong Dong Bai called Against Equality, right? Again, a title that will sound very strange to American ears. So I was talking about this to a Chinese audience, and I was saying, wow, I'm so amazed that the noble lie doesn't strike anybody as wrong, but just obvious. And they said to me, well, don't you think it's more complicated than that? Because if you write in publicly published essays that, of course, we live in a country ruled by a noble lie, isn't that a form of criticism? And I thought, gosh, yeah, that could be taken as criticism. So now the question is it taken, is it felt to be so true that nobody finds it a critical item? Or is it actually a bold thing to do to say, I know that my country is run by a noble lie because you're exposing your noble lie, right? And that's going to be, for me, still a big question mark as I continue to think about these issues. So those are some of the things I talked about in the first 3 chapters of the book. The rest of the book deals with the use of rationality as an ideological word in the arguments between Chinese and American scholars, redefining rationality as different things, linking rationality to a kind of Weberian an instrumental rationality that has no morality attached to it, going back and forth over whether Confucius's teachings are rational, etc. And then I talk a little bit about the fondness for Leo Strauss that was in place for about 2 decades. And finally, I end with a discussion of the word harmony, which is very big in the Chinese national agenda right now. When Socrates and Confucius are talked about in the same article and compared, often Confucius will come out in support of harmony and Socrates will come out in support of difference. You know, he's always criticizing the status quo. And often what writers will do is they'll reread what Socrates says in order to say that actually Socrates and Confucius can be harmonized together. So there's harmony once again, and the only people who aren't harmonious are the modern warmongering Westerners. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't go too fast. I hope parts of it were interesting. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We have about 15 minutes left for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can either use the hand raise feature or just jump in.
I've turned on the comments now so I can see them. Well, there's a lot of... there's some questions about Lee. Oh, did I say 1911? 2011, sorry. Eric Lee. Eric X. Lee is the name of the person who wrote the NYT opinion piece.
I have a question.
Yes, fire away, please.
Okay, hi. So my question is about so Plato kind of arrives to China fairly late. Well, okay, so I have two questions. One, is there any evidence of interaction with Plato during the early kind of missionary travels to China, such as the medieval Franciscan or the Jesuit expeditions to China? And my second question is kind of related. Did China is there any evidence of like Neoplatonic mysticism in China, or did China completely miss that side of the Platonic experience in the West?
Great questions. I'll answer them in reverse order. As far as I know, I have not read much about Neoplatonic mysticism at all. And in fact, in the scholars that I'm reading about these classical texts, and perhaps my view is narrow because of where I'm looking, but in the scholars I've been reading, Christianity itself doesn't get that much attention, right? These scholars will often draw a straight line from classical Greece to the contemporary US without considering a whole lot of complicating factors that came in between then and now. One of them being, of course, Christianity, but also there are a whole lot of other shifts and earthquakes in our connection to antiquity. As for the first one, no, so the Jesuits were, and the Franciscans were in China in the 16th and 17th centuries. They weren't super successful in their proselytizing, but the Jesuits did have an amazing representative in Matteo Ricci, who went first to Macau and then to the Chinese court in the 16th century. And Matteo Ricci wanted to both proselytize Catholicism and to win the interests of the Chinese court by showing them examples of Western technology like watches or mat making. And he felt that if they admired the technology, maybe they would associate the technology with the religion as well, as both features that complemented each other. But unfortunately, many of the Catholic texts he could have used would have simply beggared belief on the part of the Chinese because they were deemed too unrealistic. So, for example, the death of Christ on the cross and the resurrection, no, you couldn't do that in China. They would consider him a very lowly character if he died such a death. Or the Immaculate Conception, no way, that couldn't be talked about. So what could be talked about? And when they were casting about for the answer to this, the Jesuits decided that they would use Epictetus as a major representative of Christianity, right? So that's problematic because Epictetus was a Greek Stoic of the 1st century AD who was in no sense a Christian and did not have contact with Christianity, but his ideas were much more acceptable to people with a background in Confucian values themselves. So ideas like self-control or being posed, valuing harmonious social values, not being oriented towards riches or gain, and even the absence of an afterlife was considered helpful in Epictetus, because the Confucians felt that if you had an afterlife, like paradise, you were rewarding people for their good deeds, but good deeds should be done for their own sake, right? So they're a little scandalized about the existence of heaven. So there's no heaven in Epictetus. So Matteo Ricci wrote a short book called 20 paragraphs, or 25 paragraphs, excuse me, where he basically just took Epictetus's teachings from the handbook and claimed that they were Christian, so that they would be more acceptable to the court, for which eventually he was severely chastised by the Catholic Church back in Italy. It was called a policy of accommodation, and they thought he accommodated too far.
That makes sense. I mean, Stoicism's always been like kind of a weird bridge between Christianity and other pagan ideas. Thank you for your answers. That was really helpful. The one thing I was going to say, and add to that is, are you familiar with the writings of John C.H. Wu? Because he might be kind of an interesting opposite side to this.
Who is he?
He's a Catholic. So he's a 19th century Catholic or Chinese scholar. He helped write the Constitution in China, or the old Sun Yat-sen China.
Okay.
And so he converted to Catholicism, and he has a series of writings where he essentially tries to he explicitly draws the comparison between Christianity's connection to Platonism and says, I want to do this for Confucius and Taoism. So
Wow,
he deliberately, he writes several essays kind of drawing these, like, how you can extrapolate Christian themes from Confucianism and Taoism. So it's almost like a Plato, like fighting Plato's shadow in a sense.
That sounds great. Thank you. I'm definitely going to read that. Much appreciated.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you.
Thank you. I see there's a hand. John Colser, should we call him?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for the talk. I guess following up on the theme of religion, I was wondering whether you'd come across any discussions of in the East of Plato in conjunction with Buddhism, because there's some stuff that Plato says in the Phaedo and the end of the Republic about reincarnation that seems at least superficially similar to the understanding of reincarnation in Buddhism. And also tangentially related to that, have you come across any significant treatment of the writings of Thomas Merton in China? He was a Catholic intellectual who studied Eastern religion a lot.
Yeah, I know who he is. There are discussions of him in a few Chinese articles that I found. He was also in some ways a harmonizer, right, between different values.
Yes.
But to go back to your Plato and Buddhism question, the answer is not really, and that might seem surprising, but I think I can explain why, which is Buddhism was never held in very high esteem in Confucianism, right? Nor was Taoism, for that matter. And in fact, when Matteo Ricci first got to China, he dressed as a Buddhist, thinking that that's how he would infiltrate the court. And then he found out that Buddhists had very low status in the eyes of the Confucian mandarins, and he changed his whole outfit and what he was saying. So I don't know if Buddhism still has that lower status today, but to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been much work on looking at Buddhist elements in Platonic dialogues.
Thank you.
Mark Reuter.
Yes, thank you very much for extremely interesting talk. I look forward to reading your book. I wonder if you feel comfortable saying a little bit. You talked early on about sort of feeling this kind of claustrophobia within your intellectual tradition, and you've broken out about it now. So could you say maybe just a little bit about where you see yourself now as a scholar, and where the dialogue is taking place between East and West? And my question comes because I'm a retired Latin teacher, and some of my best students were exchange students from China. And I felt that as a classicist, I was speaking from deep within the Western tradition, and I was always trying to create those dialogues, which are very hard to sustain. So just some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I understand exactly what you're talking about with the kind of pedagogical misalignment often when we're talking to students from the mainland. What it did for me, some very basic things. I mean, I look back and I'm embarrassed that I needed to read this stuff to have this mentality. But when I was reading a lot about Confucian values and reading a lot about Ren, which can be translated as kind of humaneness, it struck me that here we had a thousands-of-year-old tradition where one of the 5 main virtues that was being stressed was humaneness. And that is a factor in the philosophical thought. And then I thought back to the Western philosophical tradition, and sure, everybody cares about being a good person to some degree or another, but the one constant in the Western philosophical tradition that was as strong is the underpinning of logic and deduction to Western philosophy, right? So Plato privileges math. His mouthpiece Socrates uses the principle of non-contradiction when he's interrogating people. Descartes says, what does he say again? I think, therefore I am, right? Kant is the same. They are all building a palace of philosophy on a foundation of rational deduction, right? And even when the right answers end up in wacky places like the Platonic form, it's still all based on what claims to be rational thought, right? What we could say that's not that rational, but the framework is meant to be rational. And the Chinese philosophical tradition just doesn't care that much about rationality, right? It's not considered a human good. When you speak to Westerners and you say, what separates humans from animals, often they'll say rationality. If you speak to Chinese thinkers, often they'll say Ren, right? Humaneness. Like that's the particularly human quality that we have. And this seems to me true. I much prefer Ren to deduction. And I'd much rather be in a philosophical and cultural space where that was a guiding principle, right? So a very basic realignment of kind of how I thought about what it meant to be human was something for me brought about by reading a little bit more widely. And I could go on for hours, but I think that was the most shocking one for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ariella, go ahead. You had a question in the chat.
I did, yeah. Thank you so much. This has been really eye-opening and interesting. I'm wondering if you came across any reception of the Republic's erotic tyrant.
The erotic tyrant, the linking of lust for power with lust for sex and lust for ownership and everything. No, I didn't, which doesn't mean there isn't anything out there. It's that I was, my whole search was oriented around specific ideas, and I didn't enter in lust. And maybe I should have, but I never really investigated tyrannical lust. So I can't tell you, although certainly if a Chinese dynast showed tyrannical lust, I imagine that he would be considered no longer chosen by, the hand of any kind of almighty power, right? Because the dynastic people were supposed to be picked by a greater force and to have that as part of their justification. And of course, there were tyrannical, lustful emperors, just as in any country. But no, I haven't followed that up at all. I think it's a very interesting thing. Thank you for asking.
Yes, and I think it kind of bumps up against the idea of Confucian self-control. But as I see, one of the arguments Socrates is making with regard to the erotic tyrant is that if you have this absolute power, you're inevitably going to become overtaken by your own desires.
Right, unless your reasoning capacity, the logisticon, is in control of the parts of your soul. So there again, how do we fight our desires? By making sure that the logical part of our soul is in charge.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Derek.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's very formative. I just had a question because you spoke a lot. The title, I mean, you're talking more, I think, about Plato, but you talked a little bit about Aristotle and Aristotle's politics and how that was had some influence or was, carried over into Chinese thought at different times. And I was just thinking from a very rudimentary reading of Aristotle's politics, which I did, I remember his claiming that the having a strong middle class was essential for the best kind of the most successful state or the most successful political system. And I was just wondering if that idea has contributed at all to China today as being just going into like kind of like political talking, like a contestant to our hegemony in the world as in America, Chinese the economic competition between America and the US and the idea that with a strong middle class, Aristotle's idea that with a strong middle class, you'll have a stronger state and a stronger economy.
I think the Chinese have certainly raised many people out of poverty into the middle classes, amazingly so over the past couple decades. And I'm sure that the Communist Party and Xi Jinping appreciates the value of a stable and prosperous middle class. However, readings of Aristotle, both back then and today, and for that matter, of everybody else I'm talking about, have stayed in this venue, this kind of public political venue, not in more scholarly university contexts, but have remained pretty selective. And even Liang Qichao was cherry picking things. There's a whole lot in Aristotle's politics he doesn't discuss. He mostly wants to focus on the idea of the citizen and political involvement. So I don't think there's a link between Aristotle's view and any of Xi Jinping's policies there. I would be surprised.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your input.
I think you're muted, Megan.
Oh, can we take one more question from Anthony and then we'll have to wrap things up?
One more.
When speaking about this political zone, political being, a man as a political being, we come across, many terms like what you mentioned, Respublica, Demos, and Republic. Now, China is the Chinese Republic or People's Republic of China. So what do you think would be a term which comes closer to what they consider as state?
Modern China?
Yes.
Contemporary China? Well, that's a very difficult question because, one does have democratic elements in the Chinese constitution. So at the level of the villages, for example, people do get to vote for low-level officials, and then those low-level officials who were voted for in the running for other positions higher up that aren't decided by popular vote, and so forth, all the way up to the super successful denizens of the CCP and the CCP leadership. On the other hand, Xi Jinping has abolished term limits, right? Making him a bit like a dynastic emperor himself. And there are those who think that he is increasingly echoing the cult of personality that developed around Mao Zedong. So what do you call that? And then throw in huge technological advances, throw in a middle class. I mean, I don't know what you call that. Maybe there doesn't exist a Western word for it.
Do you think that, I mean, the idea of democracy as Westerners know it, is something to be excited about from their side, or is it something, very suspicious?
They're not excited about it. I mean, we like to listen to the Chinese dissidents and so forth, and they get a lot of media time. But there have been polls in which, it turns out that 80, 85, 88% of the Chinese don't think democracy is a good idea because they think it's inherently unstable, right? And that instability has bad economic and political ramifications, right? So they prefer stability. And it's, again, I think a lot boils down to culture. As you are educated, are you told that liberty or individualism is the highest value, or are you told that the society is more important than the individual, and that individualism or the right to vote is less important than prosperity and security? Right? People believe different things, often depending on where they grew up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you, Shadi, for this wonderful talk. Just a quick announcement from the Institute. We announced our spring classes. I'll put the link in the chat. And thanks again. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.